World record lockdowns, huge protests, and politicians scared to appear in public. Just who is really running the show in the People's Constitutional Monarchy of Australia? Let's go finding out as we go busting the narrative. You have to look hard to find anything in Australia's history that resembles an uprising, much less a rebellion. The closest you'll find is the Eureka Stockade of 1854, in which police and soldiers overran a bunch of gold miners who were protesting against license fees in Ballarat, Victoria, killing some of them and arresting the remainder for, among other things, the serious crime of treason. But in typical Aussie style, all of this didn't escalate into much. The arrested so-called rebels were either found not guilty by a sympathetic jury or acquitted overall. They emerged from the courthouse to a jubilant crowd and eventually became folk heroes. Now, I don't think that would happen today, though. For better or worse, Australians are not so quick to side with disaffected underdogs anymore. Take this story, for example. In September, 2 Melbourne Aussie rules football fans concocted an elaborate plan to sneak illegally across state borders into Perth, Western Australia, to watch their team play in the grand final of the National Football League. They were caught, hauled before the bench, pleaded guilty, and sentenced to 10 months in prison, reduced to 3. Both will spend Christmas behind bars. But it's the response from ordinary West Australians that indicates a big change has occurred since those heady days on the Victorian goldfields in the 19th century. Now, granted, breaking quarantine rules during a pandemic is slightly more risky than protesting against a fee to pan for gold, but the vitriol directed at the Victorian footy fans didn't take into account the fact that both men had indeed tested negative for COVID. And it wasn't long ago that Australians cheered that sort of bravado, but not so much anymore.
And anyone else who's acted in that way, allegedly, are entitled, despicable criminals.
West Australians have been repeatedly reminded by the government that the state's locked border has kept them safe and kept the marauding coronavirus out of their lives and allowed them to live relatively freely, if you consider a cage 1/3 the size of Australia, freely. So their response to these 2 border-hopping interlopers was no less harsh, calling them offensive names and celebrating their incarceration no less. A lot has changed in Australia during this pandemic, not least of which is that much of the population has become strangely comfortable with the ever-encroaching presence of Big Brother. Of course, Australians didn't used to be like this, or if they were, they kept it well hidden. As the late great writer Clive James once said, the problem with Australians is not that so many of them are descended from convicts, but that so many of them are descended from prison officers. Some politicians have capitalized on this change in reassuring their electorates with their, how do I put this kindly, parochial resolve.
We need a ring of steel around Sydney so that this virus is not spreading.
I think it's a bit rich for New South Wales to start blaming Queensland.
We've got a chance to stop this dead in its tracks.
We suppress it and we get rid of it. That is the Australian approach.
Yes, that's it. First you frighten the people, then you comfort them with your jingoistic rhetoric. Hey, it's worked before. Meanwhile, Victoria's police have done their best to reenact the Eureka Stockade on the streets of Melbourne by recently harassing little old ladies sitting on a park bench and throwing various other citizens to the ground and spraying them with pepper spray. Times sure have changed. In 1854, to get that sort of treatment from Victorian cops, you had to burn your mining license, swear allegiance to another flag, build a stockade, and openly advocate sedition. Last weekend, Victorians finally said, though, that they'd had enough. More than 70,000 of them turned out in the rain in the centre of Melbourne to protest 2 things: vaccine mandates and, more importantly, the state government's proposal to grant itself even more draconian powers, potentially in perpetuity. Some of them even marched under the Eureka flag, which, curiously, is an increasingly common sight in Australia these days. What wasn't a common sight of the protests were politicians who mostly ignored it, which is a shame because last weekend's march looked a lot like a happy occasion despite the rain. One bloke brought an inflatable punching bag in the shape of Dan Andrews, but even he said he didn't want to see any rushing to the real barricades.
It's just a memento for today. It's not about punching it. We're about a peaceful protest.
For the most part, these are people who thought they had done the right thing by enduring the longest lockdown in the world, only to be told that the government now wants the power to declare a pandemic even when there isn't one, and throw people in jail without trial if they break the next arbitrary lockdown. The overreach is alarming, and more people are realizing it. Victorian Premier Dan Andrews learned last week that he can't even attend a staged photo op without being emphatically abused. Dan Andrews hardly ever appears in public anymore these days, and he'll do so even less after last week. More protests are planned for other cities across the country next week, and let's see if they show more of that Aussie irreverence towards politicians that expats like me know and admire. As legendary Australian diplomat Sir Les Patterson told American talk show host Don Lane in 1983,
what about the political scene at the moment in Australia?
Well, what about it? You know, here we are in Australia, and it's a dramatic time in our history.
It might be a little more dramatic than usual these days, but if last weekend's protest is any indication, Aussies are, like they were in 1854, uniting again about who the real villains are. Thanks for watching, and support this channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing below, and I'll see you next week for more Busting the Narrative.